All right, I think this is the last session of the day, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I think my buddy Tyler over here has the honors of closing both days. He has 2 talks. So he kind of comes to us from Jenkins fame, I guess. But he also is an epic troll in IRC. I love talking to the guy. I love having brews with the guy. So he's going to tell us what you're doing wrong, so prepare to get yelled at. Here's Tyler.
Thanks. What an introduction.
I forgot one thing in my intro.
Emergency exits?
Sorry. No, not emergency exits. After this, VMware is throwing the social hour with the beer and the sponsors. So basically, you walk out there, and you get a beverage, and you thank VMware because they paid for it. And then you go talk to the other sponsors while you're drinking your beer, and then you talk to everybody else, and you have some more beer. And then you thank VMware one more time, and you enjoy yourself the rest of the evening. So I just want to make sure of that. Thanks.
All right, so I'm actually not going to yell at you. I thought long and hard about how aggressive I should be. I originally I was going to submit this talk. If you recognize Bill O'Reilly here, this is from the "Fuck It, We'll Do It" live clip. But I thought Puppet Labs wouldn't want to print "fuck it" in their program or schedules or anything like that. So it's just we'll do it live. So I'm R. Tyler Croy. I work at a company called Lookout, and I'm going to talk about ops anti-patterns. And if you're not really familiar with the notion of anti-patterns, it kind of comes from the Ruby community to some extent, where there's a lot of opinionated people in the Ruby community, so it's a lot easier politically to say what not to do than what you should do. So really, I think this talk is more about ops Schadenfreude than anything else. If you're not familiar with the term Schadenfreude, then look it up. It's a really good one. So right, I work at Lookout Mobile Security, and what I actually do there is I'm an app developer, which is why I actually feel comfortable telling ops people what they should do, because that's a thing app developers do. I've been called wanty by ops people before. I know enough about ops to be dangerous and screw things up. So I'm not really all that qualified to be telling you exactly what you should be doing. What I've done to prepare for this talk is I've gone to everyone I respect in the ops community, and some people that I don't respect, but I really wanted to hear them rant. And I've asked them, like, what are your biggest mistakes, what worked and then turned out to be a stupid idea, those sorts of things. And skip one slide. So I've been responsible for infrastructure in the past, and I've made my own mistakes, and I'll slip some of those in here. And you'll know that they're mine because I'll take credit for them. For everyone else, I've got to kind of keep things anonymized so I don't call out anybody specifically. That was one of the promises I made to everyone who had a beer with me, is that I wouldn't name names and what they were doing. So essentially, this talk is really going to be about failure. At some point or another, everyone fucks up. That's going to happen. As a Ruby developer, I can tell you I do it every day, multiple times a day. As an sort of part-time operations engineer, when I do it, I get yelled at, and I can empathize with those of you that have also had failure in the past. And this isn't just technical failure, but also process failure or cultural failure. I've noticed when I've had beers with ops people that there's a strong oral tradition of talking about war stories, or like, oh man, this was so messed up, like we did this wrong, and just completely lambasting their previous work. And I think this is what attracts me to ops people in general, is that I also like to make fun of my own failure. So let's talk about anti-patterns, and let me have a drink. So I might as well start with the first no-brainer, is that you should be using configuration management. I wasn't sure if I should really say anything about this at PuppetConf, but I've worked with people in like 2012 who are not using configuration management. I've talked with people who I respect who are still not using configuration management, who are still hand-rolling machines or crafting AMIs and deploying those. And it kind of works for a 10-person shop. And that's one thing to keep in mind for everything that I talk about, is there's a time and place to take shortcuts and accrue technical debt. When you're 10 people, your focus is on getting things out the door. when you're 100 people or when you're 1,000 people, you better have your shit correct, or there's going to be some serious problems. That said, I want to also talk about infrastructure as code. As an app developer, code is my bread and butter. And I've seen a lot of really bad Puppet. You don't have to go very far on GitHub or the Forge to see some really not great things. And if you're going to talk about infrastructure as code, this fly wants some of my beer too. If you're going to talk about infrastructure as code, then you need to treat infrastructure like a real grown-up software engineering project with real grown-up software engineering practices. You can't just cobble shit together and expect it to work over the long term. Like, it's great to tinker around with Puppet and get things working, but there's a certain time when you need to start thinking about, things like, testing. And this is kind of what my talk is about tomorrow, because I have done a good amount of work with testing Puppet. But if I'm a colleague of yours and you're writing some Puppet code, I have no way to know whether this works or not. Like, unless there are tests, I'm just guessing based on your reputation and how often you've screwed these things up before that you actually ran that Puppet code, that you've compiled catalogs and made sure that things actually work. So there's that sort of manual level testing, and that works for a small group. But then you need to start talking about automated testing. And I don't know how many people went to Dom's talk about what Puppet Labs does to test Puppet Labs' stuff, but it's really intricate, and there's a lot of moving parts, and that's super important to do, because you're talking about provisioning machines, these large clusters of things, and you've got to get automated testing, because if Puppet Labs needed to do manual testing of all of their different products on all of the different platforms, on all of the different versions of Ruby, and all of these other products, it would require a huge offshore QA team, and it would take forever to get Puppet releases out. If you're just manually testing things, this is actually what I've done for a lot of my time with Puppet, just kind of tinkering with things in development, and it works fine up into a certain point, and then it doesn't work well at all. And so tinker-driven development is going to get you so far. For a small project, it's going to work great. For a large project, it's going to fall down. If you've got 5 people working together, tinkering with things until they work is not going to get you very far before you have to go in and rewrite things, or you just break things in production. Aside from the testing specifically, there's also a notion in software called release management, which is something that seems to be a novel idea to a lot of sysadmins and ops engineers that I've worked with, to where if you work with Puppet code and you deploy Puppet code, you should maybe put some release management practices between points A and B. If I came to you as an ops person and said, hey, maybe give me root to these machines because I'm going to go ahead and just edit all my app on the production host, you would punch me in the face, and rightfully so. You shouldn't be doing that either. Like, there's Git tags, there's tests, there's Jenkins, there's release processes that have been defined for various groups within the software engineering world that apply just fine to managing Puppet for production. I should also mention that having 0 people with software engineering background in your ops team is also what I would consider an anti-pattern. Sysadmins are really, like, every sysadmin that I've ever met and worked with has been really great at scripting things. And scripting things gets the job done once, and that's really good. But if you take 10 sysadmins and you put them in a room and you leave them there for a year, then you've got Perl script on top of Bash script on top of Python script on top of Perl script on top of Bash script until you've got this big, like, wasp nest full of crap that no one can figure out what does because there's no documentation, there's no test, there's no release process, there's no software engineering. It's just scripting cobbled together. Somewhat related, and this, I see a lot of purple shirts in the room, so I don't want to talk too much about this. I've seen a few demos from people at Puppet Labs, and I've seen people do this in articles and books. I really think editing things in etc. Puppet is bananas, like outright crazy. We've got tools like Vagrant. And there's no excuse to not be using something like that to do local work. And so if you're running and sudoing to root to edit Puppet on your local machine, I actually don't care what you do on your local machine. But if you're sudoing to root on the staging Puppet master and editing code, as an app developer, I'm going to want to punch you in the face. because I can't do that. You don't give me root access to staging. Like, why should you have root access? So I don't think Puppet Labs ever does that. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. Just for demos. Just for demos.
Unless there's a pink sombrero.
Unless there's a pink. I don't know what that means. Anyway. So the kind of underlying theme to all of this here is that code is like serious business. There's practices that should be involved in developing Puppet that you can steal from the software engineering world that work just fine. And they'll help you improve reliability, stability, and make sure that you don't push out bad Puppet code into production and find out way too late what's gone wrong. So kind of jumping, I guess, I'm going to jump around a little bit because I completely changed how this talk was structured last night because I'm an idiot. I want to talk a little bit about workflow as well. This is something that's going to vary from kind of organization to organization. But one thing I've seen from business people and app developers like myself is this sort of notion that failure is not an option. We look at operations like it's a big Boolean switch to where it's like the site is on, the site is off. What the fuck? Why is the site off? Fix it, fix it. And failure can happen at a lot of different levels, and it needs to be anticipated at a lot of different levels. And so approaching this idea that, everything is going to fail or everything's not going to fail, or that failure cannot happen for some particular component is wildly dangerous. And I've got a good example of something that I've done myself that I'm comfortable talking about, where I've actually built something as an app developer / ops engineer that didn't turn out or didn't start as a single point of failure. We didn't view it as a single point of failure. We had a work queue. We needed a sort of low bandwidth work queue. So being idiots, we decided to put that into MySQL because what does a better job of adding and deleting rows than MySQL? So we built a queue in MySQL, and we didn't have much traffic going into it. And so that was fine because no one was using the product. But as we started to put more traffic into the product, the database started to churn more. And when the database started to churn more, requests started to fail, and the application fell over because we had tightly coupled the application to this one critical part of infrastructure that was probably poorly designed to begin with. So the first thing we did was say, we should maybe make this more fault tolerant. We decided to use something that was web scale, and we used a different work queue system. And that was all fine and good, and everything sort of worked fine for a little bit until we started to put more traffic into it. And as we put more traffic into it, we increased the riskiness of running this single point of failure. And one night, all of our workers died, the queues backed up, the disks filled up, our tilers were paged, the site went offline, and people got pissed. And it was all because of one single point of failure that started out innocuous, and as the application changed over time, we weren't really paying attention to the underlying infrastructure. We were only paying attention to the application. So I've drawn a very informative, helpful diagram of our infrastructure at the time. And we had built up everything around this one single point of failure. And no one thought about it. No one considered, hey, maybe this is a stupid idea. And we didn't really address it until a disaster struck. And the big thing I've noticed when I've talked with people is that ops tends to be very reactive in general. And only until a disaster or some sort of giant mistake occurs will real change in a meaningful way actually happen. And that's something that you really shouldn't do. I don't know how you solve that in every organization, but you have to be aware that points of failure are going to change because the application is going to change. If you deploy and set up the infrastructure once and the app never changes, that's fine. If your user load never changes, that's fine. You probably don't have anything to worry about in the future, but everything is changing and moving forward. And we've come up with in the sort of app and ops team at Lookout with sort of a colloquialism, if you will, that we've got some things that are on Team Never Fail. This idea that these things are so critically important that they cannot fail, and we've got to do everything to avoid it. And what happens when you're on Team Never Fail is you should really be looking at one of two things. You either call shenanigans and tell someone they're full of shit and that you have to have things be able to fail and you have to have graceful fallover or disaster recovery, or you can get a huge contract or increase your budget to spend money on high availability software or even hardware and install that. And chances are, if you don't care to really address the fault tolerance issues in the application interfacing with the infrastructure, you're probably not going to test the high availability software failover very well at all either. And so you're probably not addressing it, but you'll be spending money, and that's what's really important for solving operations problems. You should really just approach the world as if everything will fail. And Netflix has done a fantastic job about this. If you've ever deployed anything on AWS, you can't help but be reminded that everything is going to fail. It's been very informative as an app developer building on top of AWS. While I'm on the topic of failure, I also want to talk about alerting, which is one of my other favorite topics because I'm on call for the Jenkins project, and I feel that gives me a special badge of honor to wear around operations people, is that I've also been woken up at 3 a.m. for some trivial bullshit. Having no alerting in your org is clearly an anti-pattern. You need alerting. But what I've also seen in talking to people is that having too much alerting is also an anti-pattern. If your alerts aren't actionable, people are either not going to give a shit, or they're just going to outright ignore alerts entirely. And so I've been paged before for, load error on www.app3 is warning. I'm like, what the hell do I do with that? Okay, the load's high. Unless I have some sort of clear plan of action, that alert is superfluous. So if the alerting doesn't matter, or if it doesn't cause you to go fix something or address something, then it's just woken you up for no reason, and next week you're probably just going to ignore the page. Another anti-pattern I've noticed in talking to people is in larger organizations as they scale, this is maybe in the 1,000 to 10,000 employee range, is that some organizations will create the alerting team that will create alerts and the on-call team, and they're two separate organizations for some reason. And it leads to a really interesting cultural dynamic to where Group A is ruining the lives of Group B, and Group B has no recourse. I mean, you pretty much have people like me who go to sleep and sleep through the night alerting people on call, and I'm not on call, so why would I care? And just writing alerts for just everything in the world. Well, we might want to know about this, so let's write an alert about, I'm not getting the alert, what do I care? Whoop. There we go. While on the topic of on-call, because it is one of my favorite subjects, just to, we're going to go have drinks later, and I'm not sure who's on-call in here, but don't drink a lot. I mean, that should be fairly obvious, right? This one actually came from a colleague of mine whose name I'm not going to mention. You should also maybe not take Ambien when you're on call. That's really, I would have thought, obvious, but all right. This is actually the amazing transition. So what I did want to transition to was that guy's cell phone. Reliability and stability. There's a tendency in operations and with teams that I've worked with before to view everything, every sort of change as risk and therefore the enemy. And this sets up an interesting dynamic with an app developer to where anything that I go to ask you about, you're going to tell me no. To where, as the days turn into weeks of you telling me no, I either just give up or go do something else, or I start pleading or talking to your boss or things like that. But this also leads to a dangerous culture within operations to where you've got this view of if everything's working fine, then we're not going to change it. And this is kind of similar to the old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, which is that's fine. But what's really going to happen in practice is the code base deployed or what have you is going to stagnate. It's going to drift from the current main line. It also means that you've got to backport security patches or different versions of libraries or maintain really, really old patches or custom builds in your apt repository or things like that. And in general, the systems are just going to drift from what everyone else in the world is running. You're generally better off, and this is kind of something that comes from the continuous deployment world of updating things with some regularity. If you do a full system update on February every year, you've got a year worth of changes that you've got to account for in terms of risk. If you're changing things with regular patch sets, then you've got a much smaller risk profile for those updates. One of my favorite examples of this when I was researching this talk is from a company, a giant tech company that I'm going to make up a name for. I don't know, like Wahoo. Let's just pretend there's a company called Wahoo. The engineers at Wahoo are really conservative about changes. And at the time, the colleague of mine has since moved on, long time. But a lot of the people were very conservative about updating machines, to where one cluster of machines is running Debian, and Debian is already kind of old by the time it's stable. But it was a really old Debian. So if you imagine, here's Debian stable, here's where that kernel was created. So they're running just super old kernels, super old instances of Debian. And the kernel was so old that patches weren't being backported. So a very important leap year fix didn't get backported to that kernel, to where leap year rolled around, and no one in the kernel community ever thought that someone would be silly enough to be running this version of the kernel so long after it had been released, that when the leap year came around, thousands of machines just went offline and ruined everyone's New Year's celebration. Just because they kept everything so old and unupdated that they weren't getting the fixes that they needed to, enjoy a good drunken New Year's. And so I'm going to jump back over to sort of, I guess, the DevOpsy stuff. I really like this buzzword, DevOps, by the way. I like that I can use it in almost any conversation to mean a lot of different things. I know Patrick's going to kill me. But it does actually mean something. And a lot of what it's really referring to is kind of silos in the organization. And I've worked at companies where the ops team and the dev team are so distinct and so separate that as a developer, I have no idea how things get deployed, what they look like in production, or have any sort of feedback from that. And vice versa. The ops team has no insight into what we were doing or what we were planning, to where any new update or new service or anything we would need would blindside them. And I think that should be, I would hope at this point, very clearly kind of an anti-pattern. I've got a colleague who worked at one of those very large organizations, not at Wahoo necessarily, but a very large organization where they had these sort of such entrenched silos that there was the team responsible for DNS, the team responsible for this one particular app, this team responsible for storage. And they decided that they really wanted to get those teams communicating to each other. So they said, well, those guys are using Jira, those guys are using Jira, those guys are using, let's all just use Jira to communicate with everybody. And so everyone started to communicate via Jira, and all work was done through Jira. So imagine you would get 1,000 tickets in your team per week asking for various things. And my colleague got so fed up and frustrated with this that he actually came up with a pretty brilliant solution. He would file Jiras for multiple people in teams at the same time and kind of amortize his risk across different people in those teams. And then if something was done, you would just go ahead and close out all of the other tickets. But he became really effective at using Jira, or DOSing Jira to get what he wanted to get done. I guess don't do that. That's not very clear anti-pattern. But everyone in your organization is a person. And a lot of times I've had really good success with just going over to the head of ops and being like, hey, what the fuck? Like, why can't we do this? It's like, oh yeah, that's really easy. I didn't know you guys actually needed to do that. And like, all right, sweet, let's do that. And the more kind of walls that you put between even different teams inside of the operations organization, the slower everything becomes. And for a smaller company, that's pretty important to avoid. Another thing about silos I've noticed is there's this notion in some companies where operations is responsible for the environment. And being responsible for the environment means they own all the configuration management, they might own all the staging servers, they definitely own all the production servers, but even down to developer workstations or development servers. And as a developer, this is super frustrating. But this means that developers have no access to production, no insight into what's going on in production, and can't really do anything without begging operations for something. If I need a new version of a library, then I've got to go beg operations. If I want to try out a new service, like I've heard all these good things about MongoDB and web scale. Hey, why not? So I want to try out MongoDB. Then I would have to go beg the operations team to do that. And what I'm trying to remember who mentioned, I think Gene was referencing it in his keynote talk, putting Puppet manifest and app code in the same repo is really powerful way to avoid that, because then you take tools like Vagrant on top of that, and all of a sudden I can run the application in the blessed environment in any sort of fashion that I'd like and experiment with things without needing to piss off ops or needing to even tell them what I'm doing. I've seen people actually in this sort of dysfunctional approach of begging operations for everything route around it. One colleague that I talked to, his team got so frustrated with dealing with operations that when it came time to build a new product, they actually didn't tell operations at all. What they ended up doing, and this was years ago, like AWS didn't exist when this happened. They found a managed service provider. They found space in their budget to contract with this managed service provider to deploy their application, and they actually built, deployed, and went live with this application without operations ever knowing about it. And it actually ran in production for almost a year before ops found out about it, and boy, were they mad. But I don't know, as an app developer, I kind of think that was mostly their fault. I mean, both parties are at fault there for not communicating. But if you if you punish developers so much for asking for change or wanting to push forward with change, there's going to come a point, especially now with AWS and other cloud providers, to where they're just going to say, fuck it, I'll do it myself. And when you start talking about tools like Puppet or Chef, like, I can actually do it myself now. I can't do the hard things myself, but cloud, and I'll get away with it. The last sort of kind of big danger about siloization is operations for operations' sake. And I've seen this bite a lot of people, to where when you have the ops team so separated from app developers, what the ops team focuses on is sort of making things more efficient, scaling things out, building tools, to where if you just break that off from the organization and they're not kind of communicating well or working with anybody else, then they might be building tools that kind of make their own lives easier that don't mean anything for the actual business. At the end of the day, unless you're working for a university or a public institution, everything should be coming back around to making the business successful. And with these silos, operations can get into the funk to where they're like, well, we need to do this, this, and this, and it's going to make our lives so much easier. And while that might be true, if that doesn't actually somehow tie into what the company is trying to do, then you've got just, I don't know, there's some phrases that come to mind that I'm not going to use. But it's unnecessary. It doesn't really help move things forward. And I think in especially smaller companies, ops should be integral to making the company successful. I've worked with fantastic ops people throughout my career who were really just on the level and focused on making the right trade-offs at the right times. Like, there's a time to build, your own virtualization platform, or there's a time to build your own tool for this, that, and the other. But there's also a time to just shut up and get the product into production, and we'll see if this crazy business idea actually works out. Another danger of ops for ops' sake is you have a tendency to fall victim to hype of operation or ops tools or vendors. I'm not sure if I can name this guy's name, but if you search around, you'll be able to find a blog post that kind of details this. A friend of mine was deeply entrenched with MySQL and knew MySQL, which meant he knew all the pitfalls with replication, he knew that the cluster stuff was a joke, and he knew all the problems with deploying and managing a large MySQL installation. And so when it came time to build a new product, he said, I really am tired of getting punished by MySQL. I'm going to go try something new. And I'm not going to name the database he chose specifically, but I'll make up, like let's say CouchDB, for example. Let's just make up a database. So because there was so much hype around this CouchDB, he jumped in full-fledged and built a full application and started deploying things on top of CouchDB, regardless of some of the good things that MySQL does have to offer. What he was comparing was the positive things he knew about CouchDB from the hype, against the negative things he knew about MySQL from experience, and that's a really unfair comparison. MySQL does do good things, and if you compare the good things with other good things from other databases, you'll come to a much more reasonable conclusion. And so what happened is they deployed on CouchDB, they went for a year, and then they found out that it was really not the right tool for what they were trying to do, and had to go through a huge, costly, expensive, painful migration back to MySQL. And this guy is smart enough and humble enough to where he wrote a really good blog post about it, and kind of aired all his dirty laundry on why that was a mistake and where he kind of went wrong with that. But it's really difficult to avoid the hype of a lot of ops tools, because we have a tendency, I think, to only look at the positive of what we don't know and the negative of what we do know, instead of comparing apples to apples. Oh, right, I had another amazing transition. Sort of in that same vein of ops for ops' sake is my favorite anti-pattern of all time, which is not invented here syndrome. And I'm hoping everyone here actually knows what that means. But kind of in one sentence, it's just, we can't use X because we didn't build it, which is a really funny way to go about running an organization, especially when you've got things you actually need to be doing. What makes NIH most interesting to me is that it's so universal. Every organization I've worked in, ops, developers, QA, everyone suffers from this, because you look at something and you say, oh, I could do better than that. And so you try to do better than that, and it turns out you can't do better than that. But at that point, you've already invested so much time that you're stuck with your new tool. So if I were to stand up here and tell you, I built a new configuration management tool that very specifically addresses our needs at Lookout, you would hopefully look at me with disgust, because that's crazy town. But what happens at a lot of companies is that NIH starts out with a little thing, like you need a little Capistrano script or a little bash script that does this one specific thing. And then you pile, well, this one little cap task just goes and installs files on all these other machines. So that's cool. What if we have that cap task also check to see if that file's already there? Because we don't want to waste the time uploading it if it's already there. And these layers sort of get piled on top of one another until you've effectively built a crappy Puppet. Sorry, I'm really trying to get through this. So another good example is Razor. I was actually really excited to hear about Razor because I know of multiple people in different companies who are building effectively Razor. But there's a lot of bare metal provisioners that have existed in some form or fashion before. And the problem with going in and building something like that, even if you have your own custom needs, is you've got to align, or you've got to put a developer on that. You've got to have someone assigned to building that. And if you're only going to build a tool until you get to that first release, then it's going to stagnate and you're going to fall behind of whatever you're trying to match. So if Puppet Labs is committed to pushing Razor forward, you might as well just use Razor, even if you have to apply your own custom patches on top of it, because they're going to support it, and you probably don't want to support your own bare metal provisioning tool. I'm going to skip through some of these just because I don't want to talk about them. They just make me so... Almost everything I've talked about, I've got very specific real-world examples and faces to all of these problems, and so it's a little emotional. So let's say I know people who have built their own inventory systems with something like PuppetDB and maybe a little additional gravy on top of it. You could totally do that building on top of what exists before. So you wouldn't want to build inventory yourself now, right? What about package management? You wouldn't honestly in this day and age build your own package management, would you? I know people who have given talks in the last 12 months on effectively their own package management solutions. And unless you're at Google, which has very specific problems, I can respect that, you probably shouldn't be doing this, because unless you've got that budget to allocate, say, $100,000 or a couple $100,000 worth of engineering time, QA, release effort into maintaining that tool, it's best to leave that to the open source community or to specific vendors, or become Google and just have that kind of money. But there's a fine line, right? It's really difficult to know where that fine line is until after you've crossed it, usually 6 months after you've crossed it, and you realize you've really gone too far. But it's something that you have to be constantly aware of. With developers that I work with, we're always trying to make sure that we gut check what's on rubygems.org, for example. And by the same token, if you're working with Puppet, you should always kind of gut check your work based on what's on Forge. It's understandable if there's a module that kind of does this, but it does a really crappy job of it, or it was designed for Solaris and you use Linux and it's just the APIs don't match up at all. Then it's understandable to build it yourself, but there's a lot of work out there that you can start on top of to do that. Okay. So I think this will be my last sort of big section. And NIH is my favorite kind of cultural thing. This is just pure schadenfreude now. I originally had this slide titled Technical Fuck-Ups, but I didn't want to be that aggressive in front of an audience. I will call my own mistakes fuck-ups because I was there when I did them, and they were definitely fuck-ups. But when you guys make mistakes, they're oopsies or like, my bad. But a lot of these kind of come down to like, it was a good idea at the time, you know? Those sorts of things. I'm sure you all have these like some ideas in your head of these sorts of things already. The important thing to keep in mind with some of these is there is that sort of time and place. Like taking shortcuts is a fact of life, especially in operations, and there's a time and place. So kind of keep that in mind when we go through some of these. I'll call out some specific ones that are unacceptable no matter what. Netbooting everything is one of my favorites because it does not scale, especially when you have a startup, which all startups want to become huge. Like everyone wants to just make things really easy and go from 10 people to 1,000 people and be Facebook and rich and everything. So the idea of like let's just netboot all our hardware, and this story specifically comes from pre-Razor, pre-AWS, from some old gray neckbeards that I know. Let's just netboot everything. We'll keep everything on a shared NetApp cluster or NetApp storage device, and we'll do PXE booting of all these machines. We'll have the same configuration in one place. There will be no sort of localized storage on those devices. It's going to be super easy. And it is super easy for a fixed number of nodes until something goes wrong, like say your central storage dies and everything goes away. Then you've got that sort of big site off, site on button, and it's tied to the NetApp device, and that's probably not a good idea. But it also makes everything sort of more complicated because then you're mounting things read-only, you're kind of putting your own custom configurations on devices. In this day and age, it's not difficult to run local storage on devices. Like I've worked with a lot of people before that will use AWS local storage for a lot of things, even though it's not the most secure because they're kind of amortizing across multiple machines local storage. So do not netboot all the things. I think that should be a pretty easy one. There's also logging all of the things, which is, as an app developer, I love logging all the things. I want my application to tell me everything under the sun. And the good thing about having an application log everything, or your MySQL database log everything, or all of your things being logged, is that you can go look at those logs. But if you're not looking at those logs, then you're just wasting disk space and, incurring all of this extra performance hit for no good reason. So unless you're actually going to analyze all of your logs, you should kind of focus on what you care about and do that. Everything else is just garbage. Like I don't deploy an application into production with debug logging on because there's a lot of stuff that I just don't care about. And everything within the operation stack should kind of have that same sort of rigor applied to it. Do I care about this? Yes, then you should log it and look at it. Like if you log it and don't look at it, you're just, I don't know, it seems kind of pointless to me. Maybe this is a good one. You should, this is obvious, right? Like test your backups. You should not test your backups on production data. So this one is actually my favorite story besides the Ambien thing that I heard when I was preparing for this talk, because I work with someone who worked with someone, and someone thought it was a good idea to let a management type or an executive type anywhere near production systems, and that was probably the first failure. But they had just installed a very expensive backup system. They're backing up all their data practically in real time from this place to this place, and that's all cool and good, right? But to show that this actually worked, some expletive deleted, some person of management's quality decided to show off to somebody and delete data in production and then say, and it's going to be, oh, it's not, oh shit. Like they deleted all their production data, and what they deleted it for is because the vendor said that it would not fail. And it was mind-blowing that someone trusted the vendor. What actually happened underneath there is someone, like they'd done a good job of installing this backup system, but they didn't actually test that the replication was working in the right direction. So nothing was actually being backed up. Like everything was set up on the backup system and on the primary system, but they weren't actually talking to one another. So they deleted all their production data, and they did feel pretty stupid. This one's another good one. Are there any network admins here, like people who focus primarily on networking here? No one? One or two? Okay, that's about the split I expected. You know, if I told you specifically, I was like, we're going to VPN the corporate network into the production network, you would say, like, don't do that, probably. Having everything on one network when you're 10 people is fine. Like, I guess, maybe. Like, even then it's probably not okay, depending on who you're working with. Having a 100-person company all on the same network that accesses production, where you've got marketing people bringing in their laptops every day and walking out with their laptops every day, or, you know, all sorts of foreign devices coming onto your network, and you've got everyone able to hit and broadcast bonjour and all the other crap that their laptops are doing on the network to your production systems, you're just waiting for something to really screw you over. And like most things in operations, it's probably going to take a disaster for that to change in this one particular place. So as much as you like those marketing and sales people, they don't need access to production hosts, probably ever. So you should really kind of separate things out. Almost done. Multi-site is another good one. I've known a lot of ops people who love the idea of multi-site. It's the biggest sort of like ops bravado. Yeah, we run in like 6 data centers around the world, replication, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's cool, but if you don't actually use multi-site, then you waste a shit ton of money setting up multi-site. So I've actually worked at companies before, not naming names, where we set up physical data centers, remote, had identical provision hardware, like we would buy 2 of everything, rack them remotely, because we wanted to run multi-site. But we never actually updated the application to do multi-site. We never actually tested disaster recovery to the other site. We never did any failover testing. We basically were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars a month just to say, yeah, we run multi-site. Isn't that fucking awesome, right? And it's a really expensive way to show off. So if you don't need to do multi-site, or if your application isn't ready to run multi-site, just save yourself the money. But on the topic of disaster recovery, even though your organization decided to spend so much money running multiple AWS regions or multiple data centers, somehow, with all these people running on AWS, every time US East 1 specifically dies, everyone seems to die, which is, except for Netflix, of course, because they do a good job about this. But it's really amazing to me that people run in multiple regions and still die when US East goes down. Preparing for disaster recovery and fault tolerance is a good idea, but you have to actually follow through. I've known of companies who will do like the sort of like, I think it's like a blue-green deployment, to where they'll deploy to the backup place and then they'll just fail over. And that's a great way to test that your disaster recovery actually works. And if you're not testing it that regularly, when a disaster actually hits, who knows whether or not your disaster recovery will actually work. So you should definitely test your disaster recovery plans. I got to close it up? Am I going too long? Oh, shit, I am going too long. My apologies. I'm between you and beer. I know, and I'm just so selfishly just drinking it all up. The one last thing, this is more on the continuous deployment. Giving developers like me the keys to deploy is a great idea, but do not let me deploy code from my local laptop. Everyone should be committing to a central source of truth, and that should be pushed into production. If I do a cap deploy from my local laptop and that's what gets pushed, then you're just waiting for me to fuck something up. And trust me, I've done it, and I know I will again. And blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Thanks for listening. Let's go drink beer. Sorry it took so long.